Wonderful, thank you. It's great to be here. Good morning. As Miriam mentioned, I am our VP of Engineering at NS1. We are a DNS services company. We were founded about 5 years ago, almost 6 now, in New York. And I've been there for 2 years at this point. My talk is pretty conceptual. When I was approached by the committee to do a discussion, they suggested focusing on something related that would be relatable to the audience, thinking about management, thinking about team organization and design. That's primarily what I focus on at NS1. I work closely on sorting out how our organization can grow to meet the demands of our product delivery and how our products are changing and evolving. So I have 2 parts to the talk that I'm going to be running through. The first looks at the major cultural shifts, technology shifts, architectural shifts that we had to go through to move from SaaS to software, with the key there being that we actually moved from SaaS to SaaS and software. So we didn't make a flip, we added in another delivery model. And then in the second half of the talk, I'm going to give out some templates and some models that we use to actually structure how we change our organization and to interrogate how we build our teams, how we added new roles. I have open templates available that you can access through Google Docs if you want to walk away and try this with your own teams. So as I mentioned, I'm here from NS1. We provide next-generation DNS services, and we are founded and based in New York, which is where I'm at. We also have a small office here in San Francisco. Sorry, this is off by 1. Of course it is. My apologies. So this is all about NS1. We have a fantastic customer base. It's our favorite part of doing what we do. I think many people in this audience are actually customers. I've seen a few of the names on name tags. But our customer base is spread all over the country, all over the world, and we really love working with each of them. If any of you are interested in talking more about what we do, feel free to come up after. So yes, the first part of the talk is going to be on our move from SaaS to software. NS1 was founded from a SaaS perspective. We offered and came into the DNS market with managed services and a dedicated single-tenant version of our software. So our managed and dedicated DNS services were the original sort of heart and blood of where we and how we operate. Pulsar RUM steering is an additional product that we offer in our SaaS portfolio that is an intelligent, real user metric steering engine that adds on top of our DNS and helps our customers sort of at the top of the market with the most complicated application delivery traffic really fine tune and figure out how to ensure that their customers are getting the right and the fastest journey back to the end users as possible. We manage one of the largest edge delivery networks around the world. We have 25 POPs that we offer our services from, and that includes a set of POPs within China as well. So we have a service that allows you to monitor and work on your application traffic via China. DNS is often thought of as an older technology. People often ask, why did you move into the DNS market? Why does it need innovation? What's new and interesting about it? A couple things here. We built our DNS server from scratch. So we built it using C++, and it's designed to offer a lot more flexibility and unique configuration capabilities to end users than your average DNS product. So we understood that the internet was rapidly evolving since the DNS protocol was invented, and we felt like applications needed a new way to monitor and to work out how to manage their own traffic. So we have a handful of features within our DNS, such as our filter chain technology, and that allows our end users to have very individualized, unique configurations that allow them to fine-tune based on their global performance. So as we were stepping out into the SaaS business and working with larger and larger customers, the infrastructure market as a whole was starting to go through some transformations. So if you remember in the early 2000s, all of these applications were living on-prem. We were managing and working with them via customer hardware. You were downloading and working on software on-prem in your own application environment. Late 2000s, everything was moving over to the cloud, and SaaS became a thing. And so we entered into the market while SaaS was the thing and where everybody was looking to work and use tools to manage their applications. Today's environment, the complexity is increasing and the diversity of these applications are increasing rapidly. And so tools that work across application management must work in both environments. And so it was really this market shift that a couple years ago started pushing us into the software domain as well. We saw this trend hit in AWS Reinvent this year. If many of you remember, the move into a diverse application environment was one of the hot topics there. I loved this quote coming out of this article ahead of AWS Reinvent that looks at how startups and other organizations that have tools that cut across cloud and on-prem environments allow for these organizations to have a single point of management, allow for these teams to have less individuals doing the work, and to have a simpler experience. And it's really this premise that focused our direction towards having a software version of our product. So our portfolio now includes a solution called Private DNS. And Private DNS is a containerized version of our DNS software. So it's shipped via Docker containers to customer environments where they download and operate it themselves. And I'm going to get into a little bit more what this means from the perspective of how we built it and how our customers use it in a minute. But just to give you a sense of timeline of when we were introducing Private DNS, as I mentioned, SaaS was the early days, and then we stepped into development of the software solution about 2 years ago now at this point. And so it's within that pink box there that I am going to focus on the organizational shifts and the impact of that and look at some of the tools that we used to make those changes. So all of this shift centers around one idea at our company, and that's a concept of product unification. And I often joke that it's two hearts, one mind, and make the developers feel a little bit around what we're talking about. But the main thing here is that we have one product that goes out in multiple ways to our customers. And so within product unification, the exact same DNS technology is in both products. The same team is developing both delivery models. And the NS1 operations team, working on our managed DNS software, working on our edge network, is operating the exact same technology that our customers operate. And that last part is a part that we're still in the transition of. So that is not a complete transition, and I can get into why that is in a moment. But all three of those things must be true for us to step forward. And the reason why we made the overall decision to do this is that the unified platform avoids quite a bit of overhead and duplication of effort. We will not be maintaining two divergent code bases that ultimately has to be maintained by two separate teams. So there's a really large cost savings, operations savings concept there that is justifying why we're putting in the extra effort to have a single code base. We're reducing duplication of effort around feature development, feature integration, that sort of thing, without having multiple teams. And then our testing environment and our staging environments, they're unified all the way up to the point that it goes out. And so we're maintaining less environments and being able to sort of center and figure out how our tech is working and getting ready and getting out there in a much simpler environment. So on the technology side of this, there was a major paradigm shift that the tech had to go through that did inform the way we were thinking about having a unified architecture and having a unified team. As a SaaS team, we fix our own problems. We get every fix out there as quickly as possible. If we deploy a bug out into production and it messes with something, frequently it's not always visible out directly to the customer because we have such a diverse deployment network. Our team was well capable of getting fixes out as quickly as possible, moving through and understanding all of the nuances of how they're orchestrating the platform on our edge delivery network. And these operators in many ways were specialists for what they were doing on the DNS software. Our customer operators are not that profile. They are operating DNS as one of many things in their environments, and it is a tool for them to get the rest of their job done. They are not specialists per se on the way that edge delivery networks function, regardless of what environment they're working off of. Many of them are. We work with some really advanced traffic teams, but the operator profile itself has to be assumed to be a little bit more generic since we're offering one product. And then from a topology perspective, we understand our network. We understand exactly what works where, when there's flaky issues in one particular place, why, what our providers are like. The deployment topologies and the networks themselves at our customer environments are an unknown. So we have to, we build our product to work in many different use cases, many different situations, but it has to be flexible enough to do that. And so there was a really large paradigm shift in how we orchestrate and work with our DNS processes from our managed services into our private product. And that I always refer to as the complex simplification, because it has to sort of become a self-healing thing. It has to work on its own. It has to be able to tell you what's wrong in a way that our operators were able to figure out in a much more intuitive type sense. And so it had to simplify from the perspective of who's interacting with it. But to do that was very complicated because we had to take this massive network of many services and package them into a handful of Docker containers that made sense to the end user. So that was our technology shift that we went through. All of this led to quite a bit of evolution around how our engineering org is designed. So I'm going to walk through, from a very simplified way of showing this, how we went from early days with our team segmentation to how we operate now with a unified platform model. So unsurprisingly, in the early days with a small team, we were segmented by function. So we had a really large back-end team. We had a couple of operational folks that we titled DevOps, and we had 1 to 3 front-end, depending on what year we're talking about. So our groups were managed and discussed, and all of the workflows went in via your own sort of functional specialization. And when we stepped into the universe of needing to build out a software product, we introduced in what I call a release engineering team. And I believe that this is a product of the way that our organization has grown. So it's a function of how we have changed and evolved over the years rather than, I think, an industry best practice. Typically, I think that release engineering, which relates to how our build practices, our test frameworks, our CI/CD, all of these pieces interact with the rest of our technology team. Typically, I think that's more embedded and more ingrained in delivery teams as they grow. But we had to make such a rapid shift and such a large shift in how we were focusing on CI/CD, testing, QA, all of these pieces, that we carved out a team. It was a bit of a forcing function to ensure that the effort was made to get this done in a way that would now match a software landscape. So we added in a release engineering group. And as we were getting bigger and bigger, we had to have management models that could reflect this. And having individualized managers, our teams continued to become more cross-functional with the type of work that they were getting done, and having individualized managers per function was no longer making sense. But as I mentioned, our products are not set different code bases. So organizing and managing by product was not an option for us. We couldn't have a managed DNS team, a dedicated DNS team, and a private DNS team, because they're all using the same DNS. The interdependency is deep and unable to be pulled apart. So we can't have this model. A lot of companies operate off of this model, and it doesn't work for us. So we segment by platform ownership. So from an outside member looking in, it's difficult to understand what each team owns, but from an individual member of the engineering team looking out, it's quite clear what the boundaries are. And these 4 that are listed out here each relate to a way that the platform itself comes together. So we have sort of an interfacing concept between our API and our core database services. The packaging group looks at how we're interacting with and orchestrating the containers themselves, so it's inherently a product of the product. And as I mentioned earlier, Pulsar is our real user metric product, so that in and of itself has its own team. But from an engineering lens, it feels a bit more like a feature on the SaaS side, if that makes sense. So we segment by platform ownership, and what we did not want to have happen was this. We did not want to segment into 2 teams. It felt too risky to us from the perspective of overhead and the level of cost it was going to incur against the way that the product revenue would grow. So we did not want to have 2 separate teams focusing on SaaS and on software, because inherently those purple boxes are working on the same code. So we segment by ownership, and this leads us to a unified platform. So we have a single platform that goes into both code bases. So our largest changes around this within our organizational model related to the tension right here, continuous delivery versus version releases. And I say versus because it's inherently at odds for us. And that's a product of how we grew up. It's a product of how these products joined into our universe together. But the product constraints that are offered by our SaaS product, and having that get out to our production network as fast and as quickly and as reliably as possible against the delivery methodology required to get a version set of containers out there on a regular scheduled basis is a very different mindset and very different culture. We started out the company, like I mentioned, focused on SaaS and with that horizon in front of us, and our developers were hired with that intention in place. So we hired a lot of those really fantastic developers who can keep up a real-time mission-critical service at any time that they need to, and asking them to sort of step back and start to document out their work and version it and ensure that every time they were moving through a feature set that they were working on, when they found a bug, they couldn't just fix it. They had to actually document that it was fixed and explain which versions it mattered to. That culture change was asking a lot. It was a huge lift for our team. And so being able to demonstrate the benefit on the other side of that was really important. And part of that relates to the value of the product on the other half. So some of that was an explanation from our leadership and our sales and marketing team around the true return on investment of making a product like this. Some of it related to us being able to now consume that simpler technology. So being able to have that tech available to us and have moved through the process to reduce some of the management, operational overhead, tech debt, that sort of thing. Now that it's easier for us to use it, we are able to focus on other products as well. So there were a few benefits, but they felt intangible at the time when we were making the asks to make this shift. So a few of the culture change shifts that I want to call out in particular. Process. It is the least favorite word at our company. I'm sure that's not dissimilar to other places, but process for us really only happens when there's a purpose. The amount of justification that comes through on some very minor changes, I actually appreciate, because it puts a lot of pressure on management, project managers, that sort of thing, to ensure that what they're doing matters and doesn't provide overhead without a reason. We found that incremental changes within process moved the team together. So instead of making large sweeping changes, other than introducing in a release engineering team, other than that, we tried to make the changes very gradually with an understanding of where we were going, but allowing the team to sort of adapt and work and come to terms with each change together. So that helped us continue to serve as sort of a unified group. Developer autonomy. It decreased without a doubt, but the processes, the tech that they're building ended up changing rapidly. So our autonomy downstream had to decrease in order to have more planning upstream. So our product team had to sort of beef up how much they were doing ahead of time before features were coming towards us. The impact of the requirements and the design decisions had to circle back more continuously to why we're building it in the first place and what a customer is going to think. There's just a bit more of that continuous cycle between conversation. The concept of done changed, because when something is done going out into our managed net, particularly if it's not a front-facing customer feature, you knew when it was done. It worked, and therefore it could go out and fix and work on this service in the background. The concept of done for a managed net is different than the concept of packaged. To head out to a customer. So packaged has so many more variables around it, around documentation, around how it relates to previous versions, around how you upgrade between them, and all of these pieces. So the version releases became product-centric, and that added another layer of conversation for our developers. And then last, from an autonomy perspective, hotfixes are very expensive for our team, for our sanity, for our literal cost. So we, in production, we are able to manage those, as I mentioned. The hotfixes for the software versions are something that we have to be a lot more careful about, so the process had to support that. And then last, continuous integration. So our lead for our release engineering group talks about this a lot. He sees CI as a tool for preparedness. So his concept of always be releasing isn't necessarily releasing out to production, releasing out to customers, but it's continuously trying to get our code coming in for multiple products into the same batch so that we can understand the impact of it across the spectrum of products and know that it's going to be fine when it goes out into the wild. So he sees CI as the practice that we have to sort of center on in order to support both types of delivery models and to be able to ensure that our version releases are able to match our production network over time. So a couple takeaway slides. For building our tech, as I mentioned, the biggest learning that we had here that sort of outweighs a lot of the loss of autonomy, the change in process, that sort of thing, is that we are learning a lot from our product now. So we're using the same product as we're feeding off to customers, and in such both are feeding requirements back and forth to each other. And that's been a huge bonus to our team in figuring out how something is interpreted by a different type of user, how it works on a different type of environment, and how we can change that in future so that it better serves all. So the operational experience is paying off tremendously. And ultimately, as I mentioned, our code turnaround time did lengthen, but the ways that we're evolving our code are changing. So there's a different type of tech debt ultimately in what we're producing, which has been a very interesting stream of conversation in our team. And the end value of the product that we're putting out there is significantly more valuable from a sales perspective, from an ROI, and from really meeting the demands of the market. And so similarly for building our org, a few different takeaways that I have latched onto. One is, as I said, we're designing a single organization. So the end value of this significantly outweighs some of the additional cost that's implied day by day. So the alternative of having two separate teams, one who works much faster and in a very different way, is overall much more expensive in the ways that we've thought through the calculations than being able to deliver in this mechanism. Our new model of being able to work on different groups of the platform actually supports specialization a lot better. So previously, when we knew we needed somebody to pick up a new type of database technology or a new language, to hire them in sort of as a generic backend was a tricky language change for people. It was a new concept. We weren't hiring a generic backend, we were hiring a specialist, and how they fit into the org was a little bit it was murky. So by focusing on different parts of the platform, people have a better sense of ownership, and they know that they're there to apply this particular skill, and we can hire those skills. And then it was also supporting specialization like QA, testing, building, those sorts of things. And then, as I mentioned, our planning and management requirements changed. They increased the overhead. So we have new roles in addition to the release management side of the world and some of the other specialists for the new product. We have new roles that we've been investing in around project management and having sort of more diligent management roles to help support this evolution. Great. So I'm going to segue into the next section of the talk, which relates to, it's a very different tone, so it's real templates that you can use to make some of these changes in your own organizations. So it's very tactical, very hands-on. I'm going to move quickly through this, but there are links available that you can look at later. It has instructions for the different templates. But as I mentioned, new products, new team processes, changes in your team, more money coming in, more services that you're aiming to add on. All of these things give you a moment to reassess and realign around how your team is designed. It's really helpful to have structure and methods to do this, and so that's what I'm going to talk about, some of the ways that we structure this. And the most important thing that I've thought through is that the obvious answer is not always the best. So when we were trying to figure out what release engineering meant to us, we were thinking, do we just add another DevOps engineer? Like, is that a way to pull this in? A lot of our, traditional DevOps has a lot of CI/CD built into the way that they operate, but our DevOps didn't. So to have added in somebody that seemed like the obvious answer wasn't going to end up being the right answer for our team. And additionally, when you have that kind of growth, you have a chance, if you use it right, to optimize roles for people who work for you already. So you can figure out ways to amplify talent and find new paths for your highest performers that you didn't necessarily have room to do before because they were wearing multiple hats. So you can strip away one of those hats and let them, wear the top hat forward that they've always wished and dreamed about. Cool. So as I mentioned, there's blank templates here. This link is at the end of the presentation, and it's at the bottom of the slide, so don't feel a rush. But I'll tweet it after as well. But there's 2 gap analysis templates and 1 role design template. So I'm going to walk through the 2 gap analysis ones and show some ways that our team has used this to figure out how to evolve and change our roles. So to start with, the gap analysis is looking at as is and to be. So you're thinking about how your team stands now, and you're able to think about how you want it to function in future. It outlines tasks and responsibilities so that you can both figure out what people are doing these days and also what you wish they were doing, and maybe what you wish they weren't doing. And it identifies the roles that both members of this specific team and members of other teams that are in the same horizon, in the same universe with them. It looks at the different ways that they can interact with these tasks. So both of the templates have the same initial building steps. So what you're going to do on these documents is you'll see a place where you can fill out tasks and responsibilities. And so this gives you a chance to think about what the team is working on, what day-to-day is like, what you wish that they had the chance to own. And they're meant to be sort of roughly at the same level of detail. So you don't want to have somebody saying, I type a story card into Jira once an hour, and then have somebody say, I build testing frameworks. Those are very different levels of detail. So you want to have roughly the same size of these different things, if that makes sense. It helps for comparison and consideration later. And aim for positive connotations. So aim for what you want the team to do, not what you wish they didn't do. If it's something you wish they didn't do, you'll phrase it positively and assign it to a different group later, rather than say, don't do this. Say, do this thing, and this other team should actually do it. There's conditional formatting in here that you'll see that helps provide some visual indicators and some other quick tools within the template that we'll run through. So like I mentioned, you fill out tasks, and there's an opportunity to categorize by theme, which helps with interesting sorting. I'll show what that looks like. But example from our release engineering. So we started out with 1 person on this team, the one that I mentioned earlier, who's a big, Harbr sends CI a lot with our team. So he came in, settled, got us talking about the right things, started enacting some really interesting cultural shifts, building trust. And then it was time for him to figure out some new roles for his team. So we sat down and we figured out and started looking at the different things that likely should be owned loosely under his umbrella or nearby. And so you can see things on here related to build, related to CI/CD, documentation, and here they're sorted by the theme. So we didn't write them out in this order, but we sorted later, and that way you can start to see sort of what relates together. Here's a second one around our network operations group, very different, but he said he wanted a second person, and then he said he also wanted a third at the same time. And I was suspicious because I was like, what are you going to do with 2 new people? Tell me all about that. So we went through and we wrote out a lot of the different things he wished the networking operations group could work on. And I'll show you the result of that one in a second because it's very interesting to see 2 versus 3. And then our engineering leadership group did this as well. And this is the one related to the second template that I'll talk about. This was the first time that I did this exercise with this company. And you can see here that there's stuff, everything related to technology management all the way through to personnel development. I spelled personnel wrong, but I've never gone back to change it because I just keep the slides where they are. But, a handful of different things. All of this this was when we were a much smaller team. We had, 5 people doing everything. So this is a look at what it looks like. And you see that, onboarding, it's a really general, generic term, but who owns it, right? Who's the most responsible for it? So you go through and you do a before and after concept. So you have a column for each person that looks at before and looks at after. I usually suggest saying roles and not people. So some of these you'll see names, most of them you'll see roles, because you don't always necessarily have to have a person sit in the role that they're in at the end of this. So it's helpful to think as generically as possible before assigning people because it lets you dream a little bit. So before and after, and you can include some other teams on here too that intersect with them. So this was the release engineering group on the top. This was an example of the engineering management, and then the one below it is an example of the networking team. So the first template looks at this from a perspective of ownership. You use this when you're trying to figure out who owns what, and you're trying to segment out roles. So it helps you identify what's being dropped. It helps you identify who should be owning what, and it helps you think about where a new hire might be needed because you don't have the right skill set to own something, or you just don't have the right owner in general. So I use these terms on it. You'll see this. All of them are positive. Lurker is not meant to be negative, but we thought it was funny. So we have owner, participant, and lurker. Every single row, if it's being done, has a number for everybody because there's a primary assumption on something like this that if you're on the team that's working on work, there's some degree of overhead that hits you. You don't get to fully ignore something that your team is working on. So generally, everybody has a 1, 2, or 3. So here's a couple examples from this that shows what works. So here you see the release engineering group, and you can start to see what the different tasks are. And so that starts with a shared understanding of what does this team do? Just like what are their responsibilities? It acknowledges some of the silent tasks for people who don't have a clear lens into what this team is working on, and it helps look at imbalances and responsibilities. So in this case, you can see that our lead, we did have a second person here at this point. So our lead has a ton of 3s, and I have them red here so you can see them. And the second person doesn't yet. He was still onboarding. So there's a loose addition here that you're supposed to look at through like a grainy lens. Don't think too hard about it because you can't quantify stuff like this. But it's a helpful indicator. And in this case, it was almost twice what the other person had. So there's some degree of imbalance that we can see. Find some literal gaps. We had nobody working on artifacts and nobody working on documentation from this team. Both of those were clear needs, and so you can see gaps here. And again, the blue is the before. So then you can help find some new gaps. The green is the after. So what we did in this case was ignore the 3 columns that are circled. We wrote out potential roles that could fill in stuff that had no owners, and then we made those roles a column. So we said, what if we have a second release engineer, a QA, and a TPM? What happens from a numbers perspective here? So we took the ones that they could own and added in a 3 there. And we ended up with these roles being loosely complete, right? It's interesting to see how much they already have, considering they don't exist yet. So it's a good indicator that you're on the right track. And then the quantification helps you see a shift. So when we redistributed responsibilities, like we put artifacts under the second engineer, you can see that the numbers are equalized a bit. And each of those lines is not necessarily the same complexity or difficulty. So working on our build strategy over the next year is a very different type of thought than managing an artifact repo. But those are both listed. So the quantification is not necessarily a quantification of difficulty. It's more like a quantity concept of how much you're owning in front of you. And it compares options. So this is the person I talked about who wanted 3 versus 2. And if you notice, he did 2 different versions. And in the first version, there's 3 people, and there's very little that has a 3. So there's very little that's owned for that third person. And in the second option, it looks almost the same. And so one of the things that this called out to us was that there might not be enough for a third person to own, and that person might feel a little bit lost and like they don't have enough that is theirs, that they're working on, that they can carry forward. So we started with 2 and felt like that was the better option, and we could add in a third later when it felt like there were real gaps that needed to be owned by somebody else. So oops, the slide is out of order. But these gap exercises, which I'll show you a second one that's a lot faster, but it does help you automate your job description. I met with a CTO last week who's figuring out how to change up his hiring pattern. And he was commenting that in many ways we've automated how we find new jobs for our team, because the list of responsibilities attributed to the column is sort of your list of responsibilities for your job description. It's probably 80% of the way there, what that person's going to do and what you need from them. And it helps you figure out what unique skills you probably need out of that person later. Okay, so the second one, which I'll run through real quick, is proximity. It's a very different concept. And it's used when everyone likes to do everything. So this was the first one I did with the team really early with them, when our leadership group was trying to stop having everybody do everything. So, you'll see an example on here, but our CEO was still involved in incident management. And so everybody was touching every part of all of our operations, and some things were getting dropped because nobody wanted to do them. So we did this to figure out how close are you to something that's ongoing, right? Like, are you really involved in it or not? With the understanding that you're probably involved in everything, so don't panic when it gets ripped away from you. And it uses really silly terms to help reduce some of the tension around this idea that you have to sort of change what you've been owning for the last 3 years while this company was going from 0 to 100. It's difficult for people to rip away from their early days. So we use some very silly terminology: frog, owl, and eagle. So the frog's in the muck, it's right there, it owns it, it understands it, the swamp better than anything and anybody else that's there. The owl's kind of perched above, and they're involved, and they see what's happening in the swamp, but they don't necessarily see the bigger picture, and they don't necessarily feel like they're in the mud all the time. And then the eagle's soaring around. So like the CEO is the eagle for incident management, right? Like, he does not care how it's getting dealt with, he just wants it done. So we did this with our leadership team, and we sorted by theme. And we were able to say more eagle, less frog, or there is no frog for this one for user testing, right? And it was really interesting to watch these people sort of step back and say, oh, I guess I'll be an eagle here, or like, I really should be a frog. And it's fun, right? It adds a level of carefreeness to this that helps. But the thing that we found from here was that we had no frogs around the people stuff. Shocking, right? So this is why I'm in the role I'm in. We designed the role that I took on from this exercise. So there, we needed frogs for things like onboarding and hiring and goals and performance management. And so that's how we chose to set up a VP of engineering role. It was time at this point. So yes, those were the takeaways I just mentioned. I'm just going to move a little bit quickly. So current team members, this is your gap in the last one that I'm going to show really quickly. Around designing a role. So benefit of being an early hire is that you get to do everything, but sometimes you have to start delegating, and sometimes you get really imbalanced in what you're working on. So I call this one the Goldilocks Exercise, and it's for just a person. So it's a great thing to pass off to a team member of yours that really needs to realign their priorities or change how they're managing their time. And there's a couple different sets of vocab: way too little, too much, way too much, or hands-on, hands-off. I like the second one. Other people on our team relate more to the first one. Use whatever vocab makes sense. It really doesn't matter as long as the template tells you something. And then there's columns on here that help you figure out who to delegate to. So if you're doing way too little, you have to increase it. But if you're doing too much, you have to delegate it probably to somebody. And so is that role, does it exist? Do you know the person who needs to do it? And it gives you a really concrete way to talk to other people about why you want them to pick up new responsibilities. So this one is also included on the template. All three of those are there. Our CEO did this one first, and I didn't include the list of tasks because he felt it was too personal, understandably. But it was an interesting way for him to start redefining his role 2 years ago, and he's done it a few times since. So cautionary tale, these are templates, and they're only templates. So they're not magic wands. There's no right way to work with a template. Change the vocab if it doesn't work for you. Change the formatting if it doesn't work. It's really meant to be a tool to start a conversation. Don't polish it and finish it. I had somebody ask me why I didn't automate little frogs and owls and eagles into it, and I said, well, that's not the purpose of the thing. But don't worry too much about what it looks like in the end. Figure out the conversation it lets you have. And then just to conclude, these lead to 3 different things that we think about with hires on our team, and that we've had to really adhere to as we've been changing our group, adding in new people. So one, candidates are different recipes for the same dish. So there are 1,000 ways to make mac and cheese. You're going to make it differently depending on what ingredients are in season, who's coming over for dinner, are they lactose intolerant? There's 1,000 different things that happen that night that you make it. And being able to predict those factors ahead of time is difficult to do and probably not worth the time until you're at the grocery store. So understanding that you don't know necessarily who's going to be in front of you, but that the senior dev that you hire this year is going to be very different than the senior dev that you hire next year is a good acknowledgement as you're moving through and screening candidates. Figure out what matters right now to you. Identify what you want to teach. So when we were hiring in our head of release engineering, we knew that we didn't want to have to tell him how to build out a release engineering team. We wanted him to tell us that. But we were willing to teach him the culture of the company and why our products mattered to us. So I think of this as well around management overhead. You can hire in somebody who's very passionate about your product, but maybe has lesser tech skills. Or you can pick somebody who codes better but doesn't care about your product. And teaching passion is harder than teaching skills. So think about what you want to teach to the person coming through the door. And then last, your next hire is not your last. And so this has been critical to us as we've been filling in these roles that are, we have huge gaps that were created. Filling in roles for that causes a lot of anxiety on the team. And as your candidate comes in front of you, nobody's perfect, but everybody presents a profile that's interesting and fills out a certain % of what you're looking for. So just remember that the person you're hiring is not going to solve every problem. They will solve a problem. And figure out what the other problems are after they come in the door and have somebody solve those later on with a different hire. So yes, templates, instructions are available at this link if you'd like it. I'm happy to send it to you later, and also happy to chat about them if you want to try with your team. You're welcome to contact me, and I will happily talk through over email or phone at some point as you're working on them. Thank you. I hope that this was useful, and looking forward to the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much. That was really great. Do we have any questions? Do we have any mic for the questions?
There's one here. If that helps. There's another one here.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation. You have mentioned having a team that is extremely hands-on for operations with a lot of expertise. Can you describe a bit how you made the migration to something that goes in the hands of a customer? Like, do you simplify the product? Do you teach them the expertise? How do you kind of manage that kind of transition?
Yeah, so I'll caveat to say that transition is still in play, still occurring. So we're only partway through that, and I expect it to occur for a long time. It's multiple years rather than a quick shift. So it's coming out in a few ways. One, I think there's a component of us learning about the customers that we're selling to, and a certain level of us wanting to meet those customers for the first time rather than try to engineer towards what we think they might be. So we got ourselves to a certain point, and then we work really closely with customers through different early access programs and things like that. So there's a piece of it of us trying to make a best guess, and then a lot that we're doing while we're learning, at least from our first few environments for the product. When I think about the simplification concept, our operations team, works heavily with Ansible. They orchestrate everything. Everything was I think of it as being very individualized. So each service will go out to our POPs in a different way. And they were able to manage that because they knew how to do it, in their sleep. They could get anything out, switched up, changed it over quickly and without a lot of overhead thinking about it. And so the ways that we're building out different types of orchestration within the containers themselves, A, has to match a container environment, and B, has to be in languages that make sense to a general operator. So we're rewriting the way that you interact with the API, you can say, and having that sort of obfuscate the Ansible that's happening in the background. So we're not necessarily changing what's happening within the product, but we're changing what you see as it happens. Does that make sense?
More questions?
Sure, I can hear you. I'll
But
repeat
for the
it.
recording.
So with the roles and the way that you've organized your team or teams, how often do you revisit that? Because I've found in leading teams, running businesses, that situations change.
They do. A lot, yes. So I had a slide in here that lectures everybody to revisit this often, and I cut it for sake of time, but it's really important to revisit. I find that it's important to revisit very lightly after every new hire. So anytime you fill in one of those columns, revisit it at some point. Remind yourself within the first 90 days or so to see if it did what you wanted it to do, like filling in that gap. And then major team shifts, so like new products, new funding rounds, some sort of reorg within your team, that sort of thing, that's a good time to redo them inherently, either for a broader team, for the same team that you're working in, for an individual. But let your shifts sort of dictate when you revisit, but it is useful. I have found it really interesting to look back at our work and sort of laugh at what we expected to have happen versus what actually happened, fix it, and then sort of go forward. So, yeah. Any others? Sure.
Hey, so I'm curious, along the way, did you lose anyone, where it was just like this shifting team practice and culture was too much of a change? And when do you make that decision? How do you make that decision?
Yeah, so let's see. I'm trying to figure out if people who left I can attribute to this change. I don't think that I would attribute any single exit to this change in particular. I think that there's been a lot of conversation and discomfort around it. I think that it has not been easy, but one thing I think that's been a benefit is that I don't think we hide it. So I don't think we sort of discourage complaints. I started at one point harping along in conversation saying you're only allowed to complain with a suggestion, where it's okay to vent a little, but you have to talk about something to fix what you're describing, because we were all very collectively trying to figure out the path. It wasn't one person saying this is our journey. So we needed to have suggestions from the team often and always with the complaints, but I wouldn't say that there was a major shift in who was on the team because of it, if that makes sense. Great, well, I'll be around. Thank you.
Thank you so much.